Hey everybody, Tim Adams here with you once again. And before we get to the topic that we're going to be covering tonight, I wanted to kind of give you a preview of what's coming in the next couple weeks. So our next hangout next week, we're going to have Paul actually talking about ProPresenter 6, which just got released into beta. So I'm really excited about that. He's been telling us about some features offline that Pro 6 has. So you can definitely look forward to that. And then 2 weeks from today, I'm actually going to be giving an overview of Dante Digital Audio Networking. I just attended a all-day training yesterday, and I'm really excited to share what Dante can do for any size church, from the largest right down to the smallest. So really excited to share that. Today we're going to be talking about the differences between consumer video cameras and prosumer video cameras. And the reason we're going with prosumer is when you get into the professional realm as far as using that term, generally speaking, you're going to be talking about at least a $10,000 investment or up or above as far as per camera. And for kind of the target market that we're going after as far as putting information into your hands, you're likely not going to be dealing with a budget that big. So we're going to focus on some, probably sub $5,000 cameras, and not really getting into specific models, but more talking about features that are different between, say, sub $1,000 cameras and the cameras above that. What differentiates them, and why it's a good investment to get a prosumer camera if you're going to be doing any video work in church at all. So with that, we're going to dive right in. I want to welcome Betty Jane from Virginia, LaJuan Hughes in California, Paul Allen Clifford in, not if I'm right, Kentucky. Yes, all right, got it. For some reason, I always get Kentucky and Tennessee mixed up. And then Tim Malone is also here. And Tim, remind me where you're at. I'm just blanking. Sorry, I didn't give you enough time to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I'm not with it tonight. I'm in Mankato, Minnesota, southern Minnesota.
Right. So there you go, Minnesota. So we've got a pretty good mix of people and geographic locations, and definitely different church sizes. So that's what we always strive for, so we can get different perspectives and we can have a good discussion. So I'm just going to kick things off here and just dive right into consumer cameras. So if you are used to going into, say, a Best Buy or a Fry's or whatever electronic store is near you, you're probably accustomed to passing, the video camera section and seeing prices that hover around $200, $300, $400 for a video camera, and that seems to be a pretty popular price point. And you may have thought, well, if I can get a video camera here that shoots 1080p, that has an HDMI output, and records to an SD card, why do I need a $4,000 video camera that, when you're looking at the specs, does the same thing? So we're going to be diving into that and exploring that. And where I want to start right now is with the lens. And what I'm hoping to do is just kind of move my way back from the lens, through the recording, through the chip and the sensor, and just kind of go in a linear fashion. So with the lens, you may have noticed that if you take a Sony NX5U, I think it's right about a $5,000 prosumer level video camera, and you look at the lens on that particular camera, it's about yay big. Okay, it's got a pretty decent sized lens on the front. Whereas you look at one of these sub $500 consumer cameras, your lens is going to be like that big. And people don't understand that the size of the lens is directly proportional, or should be directly proportional, to the size of the sensor. And we'll get into the size of the sensor in a little bit. But the basic rule of thumb, and Paul, please jump in here at any time, But the basic rule of thumb, as I understand it, is the larger the lens, the more light is able to get in and hit the sensor, which generally means you get a better image. Now, there are a lot of variables, and we'll talk about that later. But some of you may be wondering how a lens works. And when you think of a lens, you have to realize that a lens is not just one piece of glass. It's made up of several elements. And those are usually all pieces of glass, and they all have a certain function. And it's important to just have a broad understanding of how that works. So here we have kind of a really oversimplified explanation of how light travels in and enters a lens. And what you see here, this is where the light gets focused down onto the sensor. And I'm going to dive really, really deep into sensors when we get there, so hang around for that. But essentially, you have a series of elements in line, because what generally happens is at the first lens, the image gets flipped 180 degrees. And so when the image gets to the second lens element, it's actually upside down. And so a lot of this, subsequent lens elements help in directing the light, as it were, as it travels through the lens, so that not only is the image oriented correctly, but it's also transmitting that light energy, that light information, if you will, at the fastest possible speed. So I'm actually going to throw it over to Paul and just kind of back check myself. Paul, am I getting anywhere close?
Yeah, and when you think about it, it actually makes sense. If you have a larger surface, more light can hit that larger surface. If you have a smaller surface, less light can hit that smaller surface. In a room with totally even light, if you have two pieces of paper and one of them is 8.5 by 11 and the other one is a quarter that size, which do you think gets more light? Well, the big piece of paper gets more light, so it makes sense that a larger lens will take in more light and a larger sensor will take in more light. And that's what video really is just taking in light. Without light, it's nothing. You might as well not have a camera. So the more you can get to play with, because it's easier to restrict down the amount of light than it is to add more light when there isn't light there. So yeah, I'd agree totally, Tim.
All right, now while I've got you unmuted here, let me ask you this, and we're going to be, I think we've covered lens pretty well. I will have a little wrap up in a minute, but have you heard of Airy discs, Paul?
Airy discs?
Airy discs.
I have a vague recollection. Is that anywhere related to the Litro camera?
Yes, it's actually related to all cameras that, well, just all cameras, but specifically to sensors. And so I just wanted to test the waters there to see if you were going to jump in and correct me on anything. So I'll get to that in a minute. But with lenses and how fast they are and how much light they allow to travel through the lens to actually hit the sensor, it's important to understand aperture, which is measured in f-stops. And don't ask me why they did this. It's counterintuitive. But the smaller the number, and it's represented by f number dot number, the smaller that is, the faster the light gets to the sensor, which generally is better. And that has a whole lot of ancillary or secondary benefits, as that's tied to that. But if you just focus on this piece of information, try and get the fastest lens that you can, because that will help you more than hinder you. For example, I used to have a Tamron 18 millimeter to 200 millimeter telephoto lens for my Panasonic GH2. The f-stop range on that, because it changed, it started at an f3.5, which is generally pretty good, and that was at 18 millimeters. But as I zoomed in to what we call the far end, the 200 millimeter, it would actually jump to 6.3, f6.3. And so what's happening is that aperture it's got a multi-bladed thing, and if you've ever seen a camera lens depicted graphically, then you're used to seeing, this bladed shutter or iris idea. What's happening is that is actually going down. Oh, Paul has something there. Let's see what he's looking at. There we go. So do that again, Paul.
Yeah, so this is a 50 millimeter lens, and as I turn it, you'll see you can maybe just barely see a dot there, and
Yep.
if I go the opposite direction, you can see me. Here's my hand waving behind it. So this is wide open for this lens, which is 1.9, which is a non-standard number, but it's a pretty fast lens.
Right.
So lots of light can get through there when it's all the way open, and when it's all the way closed, not as much light.
Now, what is that, f22 on the small side?
Let's see here. Looks like it is 16, f16.
Okay, f16. Right. So that is a perfect analogy, visual. Thank you, my friend.
I try.
I appreciate that. I talk, Paul finds the props. It's a great symbiotic relationship. So, yeah, that actually proved everything. And actually, hold that lens up again if you would. There was one other thing I wanted to point out. So hold it right up in front of your face and open it all the way. Notice he's upside down. So don't ask me how. That's very nice. But yes, he's upside down from our standpoint. So I don't know if the camera's actually doing the image flip or if there's some other element. Paul, do you have comment on that? You're not. You gotta unmute yourself there.
Yeah, I muted myself. I think that it's the camera. This is a DSLR lens, so it's actually a vintage lens, a Vivitar. So I think that the way that it's set up is that basically the sensor is just upside down, and therefore when it gets an upside down image, that comes out as right side up. So.
Go figure. I'm not going to get into the mechanics of that. I really want to move on to the sensor. So first thing you need to understand is there are two primary kinds of sensors out there. There's charge coupled device, which is CCD, and there's CMOS, and I'm not going to bore you with what that acronym actually means because I actually would have to look it up. But suffice to say that CCD has been the standard for many, many years, and the reason for that up until lately is the cost of production. The cost to produce a CMOS imager or imaging chip was prohibitively expensive, and so we haven't really seen them until recently because the machining process and the process they use to make them has actually come down in price, and so it's actually more cost efficient and more beneficial to put CMOS imagers in cameras. And actually, based on research I did today, this afternoon, it has to do with the bandwidth that is required for the imager to send the information on, into the rest of the camera, to the recording area, for example. And So CCDs are able to capture an entire image at once, which is great for certain applications. Whereas CMOS will actually start at the top and capture down, which is why we get this effect called rolling shutter. And rolling shutter is an inherent issue with CMOS imagers. And what happens is in fast motion, straight lines like this pen would actually appear bent or crooked. You know, it would actually appear like this, because what's happening is by the time, you remember this is fast motion, okay? So like whip pans, crash zooms, I don't know if it would really affect, it probably would, but what's happening is by the time the imager is capturing the bottom of the pen, the camera position has moved. And so it's going to appear much like this with probably a little bit of a curve in it. And it's an issue that manufacturers are still combating to this day, and they're getting better. Whereas CCDs have what's called a global shutter. And because it captures it all at the same time, you don't get that issue. There is a drawback in certain circumstances with CCDs. I personally have never come across it, so I'm not really going to talk about it. So moving on to Airy discs, and it's Airy, A-I-R-Y, discs, refers to the smallest point of light, or the smallest point that light can be focused down to. And this is very important because when we're talking about the size of imaging chips, they generally tend to be much larger in the prosumer cameras than in the consumer. So why that matters is because on a smaller chip, so in a consumer camera, they have much smaller chips because the real estate just isn't there. It costs a lot more money to make a bigger camera. You know, that makes sense. So with a smaller chip, think like your cell phone, okay? They're still cramming in, let's say, the same number of pixels that they are in larger imagers. And in order to do that, the size of the pixels has to be much smaller. Well, where Airy discs come in is, so you have this finite known size of an area that light can be focused down to. And what you're doing is you're throwing pixels at this dot, and you're taking up, say, 21 pixels to capture that dot, whereas a larger sensor takes up maybe 9. Okay? And so all of a sudden, what you're seeing is you're seeing wasted pixels because they're smaller than the Airy disc size. Does all that make sense? Tim's kind of, yeah, kinda, sorta. All right, so let's do this. Let's say that this is an Airy disc. All right, give me a second while I get my primary light source back here. All right, so this is the size of an Airy disc, okay? And this, the point of this pen is one of those pixels in a consumer camera, all right? So it's going to take me a lot of these pixels to capture this. Does that make sense? You with me so far? All right. Whereas, I need something else round. All right. Say the end of this battery is the size of a pixel on a, let's say, a DSLR sensor. All right. Well, obviously, that's going to take, let's see, I got to get this turned right, much fewer pixels to capture that Airy disc. Still with me? All right. So because the pixels are larger, I don't have to use as many to capture that light. We good? All right. So because of that, we're getting much higher quality imagery because we're not wasting our pixels, which is why images on prosumer cameras and DSLRs look sharper, even when you blow them up. or crop into them is what we call it. So that, if I've got this frame, all right, I can crop into my face, and my features are going to be much, much sharper on a larger sensor camera than they are going to be on a smaller sensor camera, because there's just more detail there. We good? All right, excellent. Paul, you want to chime in on anything there?
Sounds good.
All right. So let's move on to recording. This is probably where we see a lot of crossover and a lot of differentiation. Now, I know that sounds contradictory, so let me explain. So we see a lot of similarities between consumer and prosumer in that in the codecs that they choose to use. So AVC HD is a very popular recording codec in both categories. MP4, you'll probably see that, but what you're likely not going to see is the same level of encoding in, let's say, MP4. All right. So, and what I mean by that is because you have more real estate in a larger camera that you usually get with a larger sensor, right? That makes sense. That means you're also probably going to have a faster processor. Makes sense. And so that also means that you can crunch data a lot more effectively, which means you can have a higher bit rate. Now, have I lost anybody? All right, Betty, you still with me? Since I can't see you.
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, sweet. So, bit rate is really, all you need to know about that is the higher the bit rate, the better the quality. And it has to do with encoding. I'm not going to bore you with details. There are lots and lots of resources online. I'm sure Paul talks about it in some of his resources. But again, all you need to know: higher bitrate number, better quality. So, just to give you an example, digital video generally, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, was about 20-25 megabits per second.
That sounds right.
Okay. And back in those days, Panasonic came out with something called DVC Pro, which was, I believe it was double that. It was 50 megabits, and I think DVC Pro HD came out at 100, if I remember correctly. So, and that referred to, so DVC Pro was a doubling of the standard bitrate encoding, and then DVC Pro HD was a doubling again. Now, we haven't really seen too much beyond that as far as bit rates. I mean, the GH4 has a 200 megabit mode, I believe at 1080p. Their 4K is getting written to SD cards at 100 megabits, I believe. So you may ask yourself, okay, well, if it's not being, if we're not getting faster bit rates, how are we still getting higher quality files to work with? And I'm actually going to throw it over to Paul on this one, because I didn't research this, and I'm pretty sure that he can talk more intelligently about it than I can.
Very fun. Okay. I was going to say something like, oh, it's me coming from out from under a bus. Okay. No. So what has changed in this time is we've got different ways of recording things. So depending on what's important, you don't need every little last bit of information that could be recorded. So, for example, there is a codec, which we've talked a little bit about codecs, a codec called ProRes 4444, and that's the whole enchilada, everything that you can get. It's used for editing. But one of those fours is transparency. How often do you shoot something that you need transparency on with your video camera? Never. It just doesn't work that way. You can't shoot something that's completely transparent and have it maintain transparency. So they just throw that bit of information away. You don't need that. Well, as it turns out, we can fool our eyes with color, and so sometimes you can have one color that has twice as much information or even 4 times as much information as one of the other colors. And so video is made of light, so we have the 3 primary video colors: red, green, and blue. And so you can have a sampling where you have 4 of one and then 1 and 1 of the other, and most of the time your eyes can't tell the difference. So we can save a lot of space there. Some codecs do things like they only save what has changed from one frame to the other. So the background behind me hasn't changed this entire time, but my hands, because I talk with my hands a lot, so they change, so it'll get that. Most of my face not changing, my mouth changing, my eyes changing. So it just tries to only get the stuff that changes. So there's all kinds of schemes out there in these codecs for making the most of a finite resource, getting the most information that you need and discarding most of the rest. So that's at least some of the ways that it's done. And depending on your needs, you may need a camera that records every last bit of color information if you're doing chroma key, for example, because it's no good if the edges of where I am are a little softer than they need to be if you want to get rid of every last little bit of green around me. But if you're shooting something like this hangout, it really doesn't matter that much if the edges of my shirt are just a hair softer than they could be, as long as you make out, the features of my face. So basically, they've decided just through work and experimentation what you can get rid of and what you can't. And I think a bitrate is kind of like if you're painting the picture, the amount of paint you need to paint a picture. You can also have a sample rate, which is how often you're doing that. And so digital isn't like analog video was, where you were making an analogy between the real world and the waveform on the tape. Digital takes samples. One little bitty sample, that's nothing. Millions of samples, that's something, and something in between. You try and get the most you can without sacrificing storage space. So some cameras, some of these prosumer cameras, have the ability to say, change your bit rate based on your needs. So maybe one thing, you only need 25 megabits per second, whereas something else you need to go up to 100. You can tweak that because it also affects storage space. So, if you're recording a 5-minute clip, it might be perfectly acceptable to have a huge file size, whereas if you're recording a 2-hour church service, you may need to conserve some. So it's all perspective and making decisions based on what you need.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I knew most of that, but you just have a great way of explaining it, and I wasn't really prepared to explain that, so.
Thank you.
Now, a lot of people probably watching this are thinking, well, I'm going to use my video cameras in a live environment, so I don't need to record at the camera. Well, yes and no. Generally speaking, my experience, you will always come across a situation, if not several, in the course of having a video ministry where you will need to ISO record at the camera. So it is important to understand what you're going to be getting when you get the media back, and how you're going to, how you're going to post-produce that. So let's jump back to the front of the camera. Let's go back to the lens because I forgot to talk about a couple things that are very important. So one of the most basic fundamental differences between consumer and prosumer is the controls that you have over the lens itself. So we're talking manual focus, we're talking manual aperture, or iris. You may hear that as well. Those are the big ones, and then manual zoom as well. So if you've been around video cameras at all, you know that you have what's called the zoom rocker. Okay, so your hand goes up through the hand thing, and you've got this little device, this rocker device, where you push it forward and the lens zooms in. You push it down on the back and it zooms out. That's all fine and good. I have no problem with that, other than the fact that if I'm in a live environment, I want my controls back near me, so I don't have to reach around the camera to access different controls. The issue I have is with focus, and I know that there are a lot of people out there using autofocus, and I am on a mission to get people to use manual focus, and here's why. Because autofocus will fail you over and over and over and over again. Because what it's doing, especially at the consumer level, is it has, let's say, a biased area in the frame, usually in the center, that it hunts to try and find what you want in focus. So if you're doing a live event, okay, and you're on a wide shot, so, head to foot kind of thing, or even wider than that, and you're on a side angle, okay, and you've got a pastor that moves back and forth, or even if you've got somebody stationary at the podium or anywhere on the stage, you're going to be biasing the side of the frame that they're on depending on which way they're looking. So if they're looking, off to your left, you're going to put them on the right side of the screen. If they're looking towards you, you're going to, or off to the right, you're going to put them on the left side of the frame. So the problem with autofocus is if I put somebody, let's see, over here, okay, in this third, they're not in the middle. And so the camera is going to freak out. It's not going to know what you want because there's nothing in the middle for it to focus on. And so you're going to get this, we call it fishing for focus. So if you can imagine a captain of the autofocus ship or boat is out there on the water, and all of a sudden there's no fish in the area that he's casting his line into, he's not going to start casting in a different area, in a different part of the water that he's in. He's just going to keep casting and hoping that something comes into that area and he can catch it. This is not okay. One of the biggest signs of an amateur production is out of focus shots, or focus that's fishing. So having that manual control is, in my opinion, it's an absolute requirement. Now, along with that, some consumer cameras will give you manual focus, but it'll be on a button system, so you can focus towards you or you can focus away from you, or it'll be on a joystick. We at our church got tricked. I got tricked into getting a camera like that. It looked professional, in my defense. It said it had manual focus, but I have to use a joystick to move the focus around. It's retarded. And this is a Panasonic camera. I mean, I expected more, Panasonic, so if you're listening, you have failed me. But I used your GH2, so I guess it's all good. So manual focus is very important. And then along with that, training your operators to know what critical focus is. And prosumer cameras oftentimes will come with focus, peaking, or false color, or a magnify feature that they can like punch in to check their focus at any time. Preferably not when they're live, on the program output, but it's important that they understand how important focus is. And I will tell you this, it is worth the investment to get a 7-inch external monitor if that's going to help them. I personally don't have it. I have a little 3-inch monitor that I have to use to tell critical focus, and I use that magnify function before I ever start recording, because once I start recording on my camera, I can't use it. So, and that's why in a live environment you have a director that's looking at a much bigger screen to say, oh, your focus is off. But I would challenge you directors out there. Learn the camera so well that you can tell them which way to focus. Is it focused towards you? Okay, which direction on the lens is that? Generally, correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, my experience, you focus left to bring that focus closer to you. But I could be wrong. That could be the Nikon way of doing things, because I know Nikon's like backwards. But help your people out. So I would say spend the time with the equipment so that you can realistically support your people out there who are really trying to help you get the shot that you want. A really good camera operator that really knows their stuff, I would say inside of 3 seconds they can go from one shot to another shot. That's really on the ball, really knows the equipment. For volunteer operators, I'd say if you can have an average of, I don't know, Paul, 10 seconds between shots, would that be acceptable?
Well, I think it depends on directing style, too. Sometimes I've been in productions where you basically have to assume you're up the entire time. And if that's the case, you kind of have to always be thinking, oh, okay, I'm potentially up. So, but if someone's calling a shot, I can get it really fast and, not paid to do it at church. Although I've done video for, since 2000. So I think that I can think of one guy who's a volunteer, and I swear if my business ever takes off, I'm hiring him to be my cameraman, because that's just incredible how good he is. And he was in, lawn work and all, so you never know.
Yeah, that's the thing with volunteers and with the crew, and inside of a church, you never know where you're going to get your next star camera operator. I've got one of the best camera operators that I came across in my experience. I mean, just took to it like a duck to water, He's actually in Florida right now chasing down a PhD in physics, because that's what he wants to do. But, man, if he ever tires of that, I got a job waiting for him. So Betty wants to know if we're talking about using manual focus in a constant manner, or do we just kind of set it and forget it? I would say if you're in a live environment, generally speaking, if you're on, say, a center camera and your subject is tracking just left and right, but they're not changing their depth to you, then you're probably not going to be managing your focus as consistently as a side camera. Because if you have a person, a subject, okay, let's say the pastor is a walker, and a lot of them are, they're going to be consistently going away from you and coming towards you, and that's going to change your focus point. It may not change it much, but it will change it, and it will become immediately noticeable when you zoom in. Because if you're on a tight shot on a side camera and you're tasked with keeping it in focus, that is really tough, I'll be honest. Paul, you'll back me up here. Especially when you're zooming in, you're compressing that space visually, and so what happens is your focus gets real touchy real quick. So you can move that focus wheel, I don't know, half an inch, and it'll be gone, right? So, Paul, I'm going to throw you under the bus again. But let's talk about f-stop and how that relates to depth of field, since we're on the topic.
Yeah, actually, I was, right before we started this hangout, I was finishing my article that's going to be published next month for Church Production Magazine, talking about this exact focus issue, because, well, I'm talking about light, and if you don't have enough light, then that really affects things. So when my church first started doing iMag over a decade ago, we were using Panasonic GH2s, which that's a prosumer camera, and it doesn't have the largest CCD, but it's decent size. So it could have been worse. It could have been that we were using consumer cameras, but I couldn't convince the volunteer lighting operators to give us enough light. So we had to have our f-stop wide open, and still wasn't quite enough, so we cranked up the gain right on the edge of noise. Still wasn't quite enough, so we actually slowed down the shutter speed to 1/30th of a second when we were shooting at 30 frames per second, which is technically about half of what it should have been. So as a result of all those things, trying to get enough light to shoot, as the pastor moved away or moved closer on the side camera, as you say, he'd go in and out of focus all the time, without exception. So that is something, if you've got enough light and you can stomp down your iris to, like, if you were outside at noon in the summer and you were at f/16, doesn't matter where a person moves, they're not going out of focus. It's nice and easy. A crane shot is wonderful from that perspective, but if you're inside and you're at like f/1.8, ooh, not fun. Not fun at all. So depending on the circumstance, you can kind of set it and forget it sometimes, and sometimes not. When I'm on a roaming camera, every shot begins with me zooming in all the way, focusing, zooming out. Every single one, because I never know the distance, and so what's funny is occasionally I'll be focusing, and the director will sometimes like that it's out of focus because he wants to cross dissolve with some bokeh in there, and it's all pretty and stuff, but I'm just focusing. I didn't know that that's what I was doing. So it's, your situation may vary. It could be that you never have to focus, and it could be that you're focusing every last little second.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It's just one of those things where it depends on your situation. It really does. And Betty was saying that the XA10, the Canon XA10, focus tracking fails. And in fact, I would say that most focus tracking fails, in my opinion. I'm not the expert on this. I wouldn't say I'm a guru, but I would say that much like there's no replacement for a human operator in a live environment, there's not going to be any replacement for a live operator who knows how to focus and track that focus themselves. So that's my opinion. Take it for what it's worth, or leave it. Doesn't matter. Um, Now, as far as other differences, what? Oh, right. Mic inputs. Let's talk about that. Because, in my opinion, I like the idea of having the flexibility to take a live production camera out into the field. To me, that just blends really well with my idea of efficiency and saving money, and not wasting money when you don't need to. I like this concept. So when you get out into the field, and in some production environments, having an external microphone or the ability to bring in an external sound source is important. When you're shooting in the field, it's critically important because, I mean, let's be honest, you should not be using the onboard microphone. Let's just put a nix on that right now. And if you don't like the cost of a wireless microphone system that's worth anything, please invest in the Rode. Is it Rode or Rode? I don't know. Anyway, it's a Smart Lav Plus. Basically, it's a lapel microphone that plugs into your smartphone, and it allows you to record, and you can sync it up later. At least do something like that. Please. For the sake of all that is good, please do that. But what you're looking for, and to be fair, a lot of consumer cameras are beginning to offer this. You're seeing a 3.5 millimeter stereo mini jack as a microphone input. My personal camera, the GH2, has a 2.5 millimeter, which is a little strange, but it's because they combined the mic input with the remote input to save space, I guess. I don't know. On the GH4, that nonsense is gone. It's a true 3.5 millimeter, and they also have a true headphone output. So being able to not only plug audio sources into your camera, either directly or using something like a Zoom H4n or a Zoom H series recorder, or using a Bitrate adapter of some kind. I think Roland makes one, Tascam makes some. I mean, there's lots of manufacturers out there that will allow you to record and output a signal to your camera. I'm a big fan of single system, and what that means is combining audio and video onto one recording. I'm a big fan of that because while I can sync audio and video by eye and by ear, to me it's just wasted time. And for me, I'm not exactly in an industry or in a market that is all about volume of work. I am in an industry that's about efficiency. So dual system sound would be a separate recording of audio and a separate recording of video. That's how Hollywood does it. And that's all fine and good, but I don't have, 150 people on my crew. I don't have 9 months to finish, or a year and a half to finish a project. I've got a week, so maybe 2 if I'm lucky. So in a church environment, you're probably going to have less than that. Because, let's be honest, leadership can communicate well, but in my experience, they like to have an idea and then approach somebody about doing it and then have that by the next weekend. That's just been my experience. So any steps you can take to save time, I'm all for. So there's 3.5 millimeter stereo mini jack, and there are XLR. I don't think I have ever seen a camera, Paul, tell me if you have, that has had a 1/4 inch input for I've never seen it. Not even a combo jack.
No.
Generally speaking, you're going to, well, yeah, we won't talk about that. So that's what you're looking for, and that's really what separates the consumer and the prosumer. And like I said, to be fair, some of the higher cost or the higher priced consumer cameras are beginning to come out with that 3.5 millimeter input, which is great. You know, I'm happy to see that, you know, kind of filtering down. But let's go back to the sensor, because we talked about Airy discs and all that, but I really want to drive this point home. Just because a camera can shoot 1080p does not mean that it's going to look like what you expect or what you think 1080p should look like. If you buy a $200 consumer video camera that shoots 1080p and you expect it to look like the 1080p movie trailer that you just saw on Apple Trailers, you're going to be in for a very disappointing surprise. And a lot of that goes back to the size of the pixels. Remember how we were talking about Airy discs and how we were wasting pixels? Well, because I'm utilizing more of my pixels on a larger sensor camera, like a prosumer camera, that means that the quality, the sharpness, the depth is going to be there. Let me give you a visual example. All right. Let's take this pill bottle, and let's say this is a pixel. Okay, so if this is the sensor, we're looking at a cross section. Okay. This is the best way, Paul. If you come up with something better, please let me know. All right. This would be the cross section of a larger sensor. All right. So as far as how much light each pixel can capture and hold, I think this is a fair comparison. What do you think, Paul? Yeah?
Yep. Yeah, I think that's accurate. Well, it might
I need
even
your mic turned
worse.
on there, bud.
You know, it could be.
I hear it. Man, it's doing it again. Anyway, let me just keep talking. So what this has to refer to is dynamic range. So I'm going to get a lot more light captured with this pixel than I am with this pixel. Does that make sense? All right, and dynamic range, just to explain, is the difference between black and white. And so if I have this much dynamic range, okay, I'm not going to be getting the smooth transitions in the grays, right? Whereas if I have this much dynamic range, I'm going to get a lot more levels, okay, between black and white. Everybody with me? All right, excellent. I am going to just change my output here. Paul, can you give that another try?
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Anything? Bueller? Fry?
All right, it's my system.
Okay.
I'm
Yeah,
pretty sure.
Betty drinks.
Because this happened last week, too. So let me just do this. All right. There we go. Now I can hear you.
Great.
Yeah, for some reason, it's like my headphone port just like cuts out for some reason.
Yeah, I think the comparison between pixel sizes, it could be even more stark, like a cell phone camera.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the new cell phones, they're talking about how many megapixels they have, and it's like crazy. So if the lens is the same size and the chip is the same size, then if you have more pixels, the pixels have to be smaller. So if you have a large format professional video camera that shoots 1080p versus a cell phone camera that shoots 4K, it doesn't take a genius to realize those pixels are itty-bitty, teeny tiny. You probably couldn't see one with the naked eye on the cell phone camera, whereas you might be able to with the larger camera. So more surface area, more light. All comes down to that. We can't cheat physics. That's just the way that it is.
Exactly. Love it. Tim, your comment, HDR. tell you. That
Well,
is one way that you can cheat dynamic range.
and we're seeing better dynamic range all the time, but God is just so good at making eyes. That's all it comes down to. You know, that's what this article is about. God is so good at making eyes that we think that bad light is good light because our eyes tell us, oh, I can see the pastor fine. But then when you look through a video camera, you go, wait, I can't see the pastor's eyes at all because the light is right above his head. So that's why we use more light for video than you would when you're just looking with your eye. You might think that the light is really bright on the inside, but the moment you step outside during a sunny day, you recognize, no, it actually wasn't all that bright inside. So it's all about light. It all comes down to light.
Exactly. Contrary to what some people would tell you, it's all about the light. It's not all about that base. Sorry.
All about that light. That light.
I could not resist that one. So, any other questions on that before I kind of begin to wrap this up? And Betty, I will get to your question. Don't think I'm abandoning you. But any thoughts? Questions? What we've gone over? It all makes sense. It all makes sense right now, and tomorrow morning you'll have forgotten it. No? Okay. Well, Tim, I'm going to give you a pop quiz next week then. You'll be conveniently busy, right? All right. So Betty asks, or says that she would love to learn how to get the sound from the soundboard recorded onto the video in her camera. So Betty, go ahead and unmute yourself if you would, and let's just chat about your setup. So I'm assuming you have a Canon XA10.
Yeah, that's correct.
All right. So I've got that pulled up here. It looks like you've got two XLR inputs, and are you shooting one camera?
Yeah, it's one camera, so it would predominantly be used for live stream. So what happens is that it's used simultaneously sometimes if I want to use that footage, a better quality footage, to extract it off of the camera, but there's no audio source recorded on board. So if I turn on the mic, you get the ambient sounds recorded. I would like to be able to get it directly from the soundboard. Because I would have to get the files from the USB thumb drive from the soundboard and sync them up. So if that's time-saving to have it all combined, like you said, it would be a huge time saver.
Right, absolutely. Do you know off the top of your head what soundboard you have?
It's a Behringer. I'm not sure which model.
Is it a digital board?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's X32. More than likely. Actually, let's do this.
Tim, I've used that particular Canon.
Yeah.
And we got sound from a digital board directly into it. And so you've got a couple of settings that I would change first off. You have a choice between line level and mic level. You're probably going to want line level coming from your audio board source. You can send that via an XLR cable. And I'm not as familiar with the X32, but Tim, you could talk about how to hook that up. Maybe you would want an aux set to that, or a submix of some sort, and
yeah.
go from there.
So I'm just making sure. Does this look familiar, Betty?
Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to make sure we have the right board before we get too crazy here. So I am seeing that if this is indeed the right one, because there are several versions of the X32 platform, you have 16 XLR outputs from the board. And I would assume those. Oh, wow, that must be in a matrix. Okay, because your aux outputs, you have 5, and those are 1/4 inch. So I would ask if you could tie into one of those outputs on the back of the board. How far away would you estimate the camera position to be from the board?
Just a few feet. It's right next to it.
Oh, perfect. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't see any reason why you can't plug in there, and then it's all about how they. Then at that point, it's up to them in routing the audio properly inside the board to that output, so that you actually get sound, because
Okay.
that would be important.
Okay, so the setting on the camera has to change to receive that through.
Oh,
Yeah.
through the yeah.
Mm-hmm. You've got a couple of choices on that camera. You need to choose the appropriate level of sound, because a microphone sends a not as powerful sound as an audio board does. So that camera can take a microphone plugged directly into it. If you were doing a video out and about, you can plug a microphone directly into it, no problem. But you need to change that setting. And this is another advantage of prosumer cameras like the XA10, is that that particular setting, if memory serves correctly, isn't buried in a sub-menu somewhere. There's a switch on the side of it. And I believe you have 3 choices. You have line level, which is what you're probably going to want coming from your audio board, mic level, and phantom power. Those 2 you don't need unless you're using a microphone. It's probably going to be the line level, and I believe that you can choose which XLR jack you choose from on that particular camera, because I know that it has 2 up front. I can't remember if it also had a 3rd one in the back, but it could
It does
be.
not.
Okay, I'm mixing them up, but I believe that you might have to say, hey, I want audio to on both channels, both stereo channels, to come from XLR input number 1, or yeah, so that's exactly what I'm seeing, what we're seeing. We've got an internal and an external button. Thanks for that image, Tim. And external is what we want, because internal would be the internal microphone, so you would switch that. You would switch that to line level.
Actually, it's XLR outs on the board, but so she'd want mic level. The board's going to be sending, if she connects to one of the XLR outs, then it'd be mic level. Because I'm assuming the 5 aux sends, which are 1/4 inch, which would be line, are being used for monitors up front.
Yeah, it could also be that they're, if you're running the audio as mono, you might be sending everything from the left, and you can just duplicate that onto the right too.
Yeah.
I don't know how the audio is running at your church, Betty Jane, but all those are questions that your sound person should be able to answer, and hopefully you could figure that out and go from there. So yeah, I stand corrected. If it's coming out XLR, you would go switch that to mic level, and those little knobs on the side there, those are basically the level of the signal. So if it's a little quiet, you could turn it closer to max. If it's a little loud, you could turn it closer to min, M-I-N, minimum.
Yep, there you go, right here.
And go from there. So
That's great. I was just going to ask about the audio levels, if there would be a need to kind of keep an eye on them. So that helps.
Generally speaking, yes. And if you're still getting too hot of a signal, even when you're at minimum, that's why you have this ATT, the attenuation. So I would start with it off, and then see what you're getting. And then if you still can't control it from this dial, then because it's too loud, then you would hit the ATT, and that should give you what you need. But definitely make sure that that you're getting mic level out of that board, unless they're sending you an auxiliary send, and that again would be a question for the audio operator. But what they're going to do is, if you ask for an aux send and they have one available, what they're going to hand you is a 1/4-inch cable or a 1/4-inch jack, which you can't plug into your camera. I mean, I suppose you could adapt it and plug it in because on the other side, Paul, I believe they have a mic input, a 3.5 millimeter. Do you know?
I think so, but I think generally anytime I can run an XLR.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, I believe there is, because I've used the Rode mic on this particular camera.
Okay.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
One thing
sorry.
that I did in this situation with this camera in a live church environment is I put a Rode shotgun on it in channel 2 just in case something went wrong, so that I would have kind of a backup. So run the board feed into channel 1 and a shotgun mic into channel 2, and that way if something went wrong with my shotgun mic, I had the board feed. If something went wrong with my board feed, I had the shotgun mic. Either way, I at least had a decent reference that I could take the recording from the board and sync up later if I needed to. And there are meters on the screen as well, so you should be able to tell, wait, those are all the little fake LEDs on the screen are lit up all the time and it never moves. That's bad. Or,
right.
None of them are and it never moves. That's also bad. You want it kind of towards the middle or 3/4 of the way at all times as much as possible. So that's something else to help you out with. And there's a headphone jack. You could have headphones that you, at a bare minimum, you could listen to headphones. Get a set like the ones that Tim has on, the over-the-ear kind of style, to block out a little bit of the ambient sound as much as possible. And, you know, maybe during a practice or something, you could play around with these settings and see if you can get audio into the board and see if you can get a good strong signal, and then the next week you don't have to sync audio ever again.
Exactly. All right, so here is the X32, the back of it. So this is kind of the area that I was thinking about. Versus, oh, come on now. Over here is your aux outputs. I guess you have 6. So, but yeah, Betty, if you can leave the aux outs for the monitors and grab one of these, then that would be the easiest for everybody, in my opinion.
It looks great. At least we've got some options. This is really great. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and in fact, I believe that I'll get to you in a minute, Tim. Sorry, I just saw you type there. So, oh shoot, what was I going to say? Oh yeah, I believe that Behringer has a smartphone or tablet app that allows you to control certain aspects of that board, if not all of it. So you may actually be able to, if you have a tablet or a smartphone, you might be able to actually control your own mix of what's going to the camera, which would take, one, a load off of the operator, because in a live environment, they're not going to have time or attention bandwidth to focus on the live mix, the monitor mix, and your mix. And so if you can take that load off of them, then that's only going to serve everybody. And then by actively controlling your mix, or having somebody do that for you, because you may be busy running the camera, then you have somebody that you can turn to and say, hey, I need more of this, or I need less of this, and you get a much higher quality audio recording as well. So those are my thoughts. Tim?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in. I was just going to say, when you were talking about the aux sense on the back, these things here, I got a bunch of them as evidence here. I ran downstairs and grabbed them out of my toolbox. It's got a 1/4 inch on one end and an XL on the other. Jack that baby into your aux send, and there's your XLR out right there. And then, of course, there's always the cans that do the reverse. They go from an XLR to 1/4, but that doesn't do much in this situation. But these guys here are, yeah, I know adapters is a hack job, but it works sometimes. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. It just
No, it's
what
fine.
you were saying there. So,
and honestly, if I were going to do a conversion like that, I would have a direct box on hand just in case, because adapters are great. They can save you in a lot of situations, but they can also introduce noise, and they can also introduce a lot of issues. So, as I honestly hope and wish that 1/4 inch just goes away, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. So that's just me. So yeah, hopefully that gives you enough information, Betty, that you can try it out and see what you think, and hopefully it will help you get not only a higher recording quality as far as audio, but it can save you time and really, really boost the quality of your live stream. Because yeah, onboard sound is definitely, it's got nothing on the sound that's being mixed and captured with a microphone that's very close to the source, that kind of thing. So hopefully that'll work out for you, and please let us know how it goes this weekend. We'd love to hear back. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up. Any comments from anybody else on the topic at hand? Paul's good. All right. So with that, we will say goodbye. We're going to sign off, and yeah, thanks for watching. And oh yeah, next week, Paul is going to be giving us his first impressions or maybe second impressions by this time, or by that time, I don't know.
Yeah, second. I've got 15 videos up thus far on ProPresenter 6, and I haven't touched all the features yet. So there's a lot there. It's good stuff.
And when did it come out?
Yesterday.
15 videos. Okay, anyway, you do the math.
They're like 1 to 5 minutes long, and I took like 2 hours to record them. So, but I just went through all the new features according to their website, and quite frankly, I'd kind of like the telestrator feature for whenever I'm speaking. So I can imagine that my pastor might just jump for joy because he loves his iPad, and once the app comes out in the next week or two, they tell me. Anyway, just a tease of what's coming next week.
All right, and then 2 weeks, and I'll be going over Dante Digital Audio Networking, and I'm really hoping that we get a good, strong showing for that, because there's a lot of beneficial features and time-saving that Dante brings to the table. So anyway, with that, we will see you later.